Hello, I'm Professor Rich and this is TYT History. Typically I take a subject in history and I explain it in great detail and then I kind of apply that to whatever's happening today. But in comments people have expressed a desire for kind of a bigger picture view of some of this stuff that I talk about. So I'm going to do that today. And what I want to talk about today is somebody had asked in a comment if I could talk about why people vote against their own interest. And that's a big topic, but I do want to talk about how the parties got to be the way they are today, or at least my theory of this. And in order to do this, I'm going to go all the way back into the 1920s. The first thing I would say about the two parties is that the Republican Party has, from the founding of this nation, back when it was called the Federalist Party and up through its incarnation as the Whigs and on to today, has always been the party of manufacturing interests, banks, and corporations, even proto-corporations back in the early part of the country. And the Democratic Party has always been the party of labor, of kind of working class people. Now, that's not to promote one as good and noble and the other as bad. There have been times when representing the interest of working class people has been pretty ugly. Things like racism in the South, for example. But those two parts of the parties have been consistent. Now, most other issues have flowed back and forth between the parties, depending on the political realities of the time. The other thing is, we have to be clear on what a party is. A party is not a set of ideologies. It's not a set of policy proposals. It is not beliefs. None of those things are what a party is. A party is a group of people who organize to win an election. That's all they are. The principles are a means to that end. The policies are just a way to win the election. You might think of them if you think of them as a corporation, their goal is to make money, or in the case of a party, their goal is to win elections. The products that they put out there, so for a party that would be the policy proposals and the ideologies, are a means to that end. And just like in a business, if your product isn't making money, or you think by changing it or not selling it and selling something else you could make more money, the parties will happily change policies and abandon previously held ideologies for new ones if they believe it will win elections. I think one of the ways we talk about politics in this country that doesn't make any sense at all is we talk as if the parties are ideological constructs. They're not. They're practical constructs. Their purpose is to win elections. Which is why they do change over time. Now, I said I was going to go back to the 1920s. So in the 1920s, the Republican Party essentially ran itself into the ground, and they did this by running the country into the ground. And of course, this is the Great Depression, the collapse of 1929. And this caused the American people to reject the ideas of the Republican Party, these pro-business, pro-corporate, small state government, at least in business affairs, policies of the Republican Party. And in 1932, this brought to power Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It was really 1930 when the Democrats took over Congress. But in 32, FDR becomes president, and he brings a new idea, an idea that was actually an old Republican idea, the idea of active state government, of the government actively getting involved in ensuring equality of opportunity and ensuring a minimum level of comfort in the country. That's actually the idea that in many ways Abraham Lincoln and his Republican Party had brought before originally. So this is one of those things that switches. Now, the Republican Party, having been really demolished on economic policy in the eyes of the people, will try to fight on foreign policy grounds. And in the 1930s, they will argue isolationism, and they will largely get their way. They had been isolationist at least since the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. And throughout the 1930s, with the rise of Hitler and Mussolini, the Republicans will continue this strong isolationist strain. Now, unfortunately for the Republicans, it turns out that Hitler was a deranged madman who was trying to kill all the Jews and take over the world, and the Japanese weren't a whole lot better. And so by the early 1940s, isolationism has become just as discredited and just as distasteful and embarrassing a policy as the old economic policies that had led to the Great Depression. So you have a Republican Party that really doesn't have anything to run on. And I've talked about this before in my video on the election of 1948. And so they are going to begin to run on anti-communism. They are going to begin to declare that they call the FDR Truman period 20 years of treason, and claim that the Democratic Party is a giant front to turn the United States into a communist nation, because that's largely what they have. Now, there is a growing backlash, a growing pushback against the New Deal state, particularly when the economy begins to hum during the World War II and in the early 1950s. There are people who say, hey, we don't really need the New Deal anymore. So that's there. But the idea that government should be active, should be involved, that Social Security is an acceptable program, that has pretty much become hardwired into the American psyche at that point. Also, isolationism is gone, what it appears to be, for good. I don't know, maybe Ron Paul can bring it back. Maybe that'll be his great contribution to American politics. But it certainly has been gone since December 7, 1941. And so the Republicans have to reconstitute themselves at this point and find new ways to get votes. And the first way they do that is by becoming the anti-communist party. Well, the Democrats, remember, their job is to win elections. When the Republicans have success doing this, particularly in 1952 with the election of Eisenhower and the Republican takeover of Congress in the 1950s, they're going to push back by trying to out-anti-communist the Republicans. JFK was an ardent Cold Warrior, if you don't know. And, of course, LBJ allowed himself to be manipulated into Vietnam for fear that he would be called pink or soft on communism. But the big transition here is going to be on race. Now, the Democratic Party had historically been the party of racism. Well, to be fair, both parties were the party of racism until the birth of the Republican Party in 1856-ish. And, of course, Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, although Abraham Lincoln, like everybody else at the time, was a racist. The Republicans began moving towards civil rights. And the Republicans had been very proud of this, and people called liberal Republicans, particularly, there used to be such a thing, had pushed for civil rights, for equal rights for African Americans. You might remember that in the 1950s, Eisenhower will send the National Guard out to help integrate Little Rock High School. The party for racism had always been the Democratic Party, particularly after the Civil War, where they had really retrenched on this issue. Woodrow Wilson, for example, calls the horribly racist KKK as Heroes, Birth of a Nation, a 1915 film by D.W. Griffith, calls it history written with lightning. But FDR will make many of his New Deal programs colorblind. He will insist that they help African Americans just like whites. And Harry Truman will integrate the military, fully integrate it, so you have blacks and whites serving in the same unit. Blacks had been serving, of course, in the military since the Civil War, but now they're actually going to be serving side by side with whites. And so you have this period where the Democratic Party is abandoning racism at the national level. Now, the Southern Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats as they are called, they're still clinging desperately to racism and getting more and more uncomfortable. And so by the time you get to the 1960s, you begin to have the Southern Democrats revolting. You actually saw the early revolt in 1948 when Strom Thurmond runs on the Dixiecrat ticket, which has one policy goal. He wants a constitutional amendment guaranteeing segregation. But by 1960, you have an election where both candidates are more or less explicitly rejecting racism. Nixon in 1960 doesn't do anything to give comfort to the racists, which had been this has been Republican policy for 100 years now. Later, he will embrace racism. We'll get to that in a minute. And JFK, of course, will embrace the civil rights movement in many ways, saying nice things about Martin Luther King, for example. And so by 1964, the Republicans decide, and remember, Republicans have only won 2 elections since 1932 by this point, that they are going to try to embrace racism to win the South, to steal the South away. This is the original Southern strategy. The candidate is Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is going to get absolutely demolished as he's unable to win much outside the South other than his home state of Arizona. But the Republican Party has now staked a claim to that classic Democratic voter, the Southern white racist. Of course, in 1964, LBJ will sign the Civil Rights Act, and when he does this, he says, I've handed the South to the Republicans for a generation. Apparently, he underestimated. It's been a couple of generations now, and it's still very Republican. In 1968, Nixon will run using dog whistles and coded language. This is the Nixon in 1960 who didn't want any part of racism. By 1968, will embrace it as an electoral strategy. He'll talk about states' rights and law and order, both of which are code words saying I am against the black people. And of course, he'll win. He'll win fairly narrowly. People don't really remember that. But this is going to solidly move the the Democratic Southern racist into the Republican camp. Carter's able to get some of that back, largely because he's a Southerner. But by 1980, the Reagan Democrat is in many ways a white Southern racist who doesn't like the pro-corporate, pro-wealth policies of the Republicans, but hates black people even more. And so that's how you get these people anyway to vote against their interests. Republicans will also have some success calling for limiting government. Now, this also has a racist element to it, by the way. There is a common misconception, it's not actually true, that government programs to help the poor, government programs to help those in need, overwhelmingly go to minorities. And since racists, or even people who are kind of very subtle racists, maybe even not even realize it, tend to think that white people have the money and the minorities are all in poverty, a program to help the poor, in their mind, becomes taking money away from whites to give it to minorities. And so this idea of small government, this idea of welfare queens, of cutting back on social welfare programs, also has a race basis. If you look at my video on the election of 1980, I have a long quote in there from Reagan's chief strategist who comes right out and says this, who says, "We cut social welfare programs to get Southern white racists to vote for us." And so that's a lot of where this comes from. Of course, if you looked at an electoral map, what you'll see is that the Republican parts of the country are the Southeast and the Big West, which is incidentally phenomenally white. Reagan, of course, in 1980 will bring religious folks in to the Republican Party. Reagan himself had no real history of being particularly religious, but he understood that they would vote for him. And so he begins talking about issues like abortion. And in these morality issues to try to boost his political support. And it works. Evangelicals at the beginning of the election in 1980 overwhelmingly favored Carter, but on election day they voted heavily for Ronald Reagan. And so you get the modern Republican Party, which basically has four types of supporters: corporations and the wealthy, the defense industry, and people who place that as a priority, although that seems to be eroding in recent times. People who vote on religious values, and Southern white racists. Now, I would suggest to you there is no natural connection between these four things. There is no real reason why somebody who's a Southern white racist should vote in favor of corporate interest. But if the heart of your party is helping the wealthy and corporations, you have to go find voters somewhere else because there's just not enough rich people to win elections. And of course, if you're a corporation, you don't really care about issues like civil rights. You don't really care about issues like religion, because those don't really impact your interest as a corporation or as a wealthy person who's benefiting from pro-corporate rules and deregulation and things like that. So it becomes very easy to go and sell this message to those people, and then you have somebody who's voting because their pastor told them that the evil president is trying to kill all the babies, and so they end up voting for a corporate robot like Mitt Romney, who made $50 million apparently disposing of dead fetuses. Because they have created this unholy monster, stitched it together from these four core constituencies. Now that does seem to be falling apart. But ultimately, that is, in my opinion, where the Republican Party comes from. I'd be interested to hear contrasting opinions. I'm sure there's people who disagree. I wish more of them would watch these videos so we could talk about it. None of that, by the way, I didn't talk much about where the Democratic Party comes from, but it's not a whole lot different. It is a group of people stitched together to try to win elections whose interests may or may not correspond. For example, Latinos or Hispanics tend to vote Democratic. Unions, of course, vote overwhelmingly Democratic. But in many ways, their interests are at odds because unions tend to oppose immigration, whereas Hispanics tend to support immigration. This all has to do with the job market for the unions anyway. And of course, Hispanics see it as a civil rights issue. So parties are always these kind of Frankenstein monsters of stitched together groups. But you asked me, how do you get people to vote against your interest? Well, that's how I think we arrived at the place we're at. Now, in looking to the future, these groups are going to be torn apart if they're not already. For one thing, the old white Southern race is dying out, literally dying out. These are old people, and we all know people in that generation who, whether they're racist or not, and we love them, they're grandparents and parents and old friends and things like that. I don't celebrate their dying out, but it is going to change the political dynamic. It has to. The average Fox viewer is in their 70s or something like that. Now that's an advantage right now for Republicans because old people vote. But looking down the road, of course, those people are going to disappear, and the Republican Party has reached a point where it's going to have to reconstitute itself. We also see the growth of Asian and Latino populations. And the Republican Party is going to have to do something to reach out to those groups too. And so I really believe that this dramatic turn to the right, the Tea Party, the extreme radicalism of the current Republican Party is essentially the party blowing up. And it will come back. It will come back as something else. I don't know what it will be. I don't know what issues they will take into themselves to try to win elections. But I do know this. It will be pro-corporate. It will be pro-wealthy. Because that is the constant strain going all the way back to Alexander Hamilton when he put this original coalition together in the Federalist Party. So anyway, a little different from what I normally do. I hope you still found it interesting. I hope you learned something. This is all kind of theory on my part, so I'm dying to hear what you have to say about it. Do you agree, disagree? Do you see any other implications here? Let me know. I'm Professor Rich, and that was TYT History.